Thank you, Madam President. You may recall that in the statement that I gave before you during the meeting held on the 5th of October, you may recall that I, at that meeting, presented a painful event that had occurred that same day in Aleppo, in northern Syria, where armed gangs assassinated the son of the Imam of the Arab Syrian Republic, Saria Hassoun, and a professor, a university professor in Aleppo. And coincidence has it today, as I speak here today, on behalf of my country, both government and people, to inform you that official authorities in Syria have caught and arrested last night 2 young men who assassinated the Imam's son back then. These 2 young men, who are Syrian nationals, have confessed to their crime and said that each one of them received $800 in return for every crime they committed. At that point, during that speech, some were questioning the presence of armed gangs in my country. However, today, and fortunately we have heard many colleagues encouraging these armed gangs to observe their commitments towards the Special Envoy Kofi Annan's plan. Syria, as everybody knows, has welcomed from the very beginning the mission of Mr. Kofi Annan, and it has dealt with it positively and in an adequate manner, as well as with the Special Envoy of the UN. It has asserted that it will spare no effort to guarantee the success of this mission within the framework of a responsible national sentiment that drives us all to put an end to this painful crisis that Syria is experiencing. Because this crisis targets the stability and the safety of the Syrian Arab Republic in its entirety, the state and the people. My country's government has taken serious measures towards implementing what is required of it as per the 6-point plan. It has declared its commitment to stop armed confrontations as of 6 a.m. yesterday, Thursday, and it has indeed done so. My country's government is providing Mr. Annan, in writing and on a regular basis, information on the measures taken to implement the 6-point plan. In addition, Syria, my country, has also accepted the concept of a UN supervision mechanism that would work within the limits of Syrian sovereignty, which the Syrian people consider a red line that cannot be crossed under any justification. We are currently negotiating with the Special Envoy and his technical team in Damascus over the drafting of the special protocol that would guarantee the deployment of a team of observers. And in return for this openness and cooperation and commitment on the Syrian part, and ever since Damascus accepted Mr. Annan's plan, terrorist operations have escalated, including aggression and the killing of government forces as well as civilians, the sabotage and destruction of infrastructure, as well as the forceful eviction of peaceful citizens to prefabricated camps in neighboring countries, to lay the groundwork for creating a refugee crisis that would be politically used and built upon later in order to establish so-called buffer zones that would in turn justify calls for foreign military intervention. What worries us in this context is the ill intentions of some member states of the Council with regards to Syria, in that they deliberately do not hold armed gangs accountable for their crimes and for their aggression against Syrian civilians and military personnel. For our part, we have offered and provided Mr. Annan with documented information on the violations that were perpetrated by armed gangs after the ceasefire went into effect yesterday. These violations numbered 50 violations pertaining to the killing of dozens of civilians and members of the army, as well as law enforcement personnel, not to mention the destruction of many private and public installations. Mr. President, what we find puzzling here is that some of those who claim to care for human rights have paid no attention to information submitted by numerous international bodies other than the Syrian government about the grave human rights violations perpetrated by armed groups in Syria. These include kidnapping and holding of hostages and demanding ransoms, as well as torturing and executing members of the police forces and the army and civilians who are regarded as supporters of the government. Moreover, armed groups in Syria are recruiting children as soldiers and using civilians as human shields. Add to all this the many in-depth field exposés that were published by major media bodies which affirm that armed gangs in Syria are committing unprecedented criminal activities. Here, I would like to note the important article that was published by the German Der Spiegel magazine on a meeting held between its correspondent and two criminals in a hospital in Tripoli in Lebanon. And they have admitted in this interview that they slaughtered 150 persons using a knife based on instructions that they received from their commanders in the armed groups. Syria has expressed its hope that Mr. Annan would deal with the crisis in a comprehensive manner. It affirms that in return for the official Syrian commitment to guarantee the success of his mission, then Mr. Annan must also hold the necessary contacts with the different Arab, regional, and international parties that have ties with the armed gangs groups in order to guarantee that they abide by the cessation of violence. The mission of Mr. Annan cannot be guaranteed success just through official Syrian support. Rather, these states must abide by holding and halting the funding and arming and training of armed groups, as well as refrain from encouraging them to continue their terrorist actions and to stop providing safe havens to the members of these armed groups. These countries must also stop escalating and encouraging the Syrian opposition to reject any initiative to launch a national dialogue, a comprehensive national dialogue, in order to arrive at a peaceful political resolution to the crisis in Syria. And it is worth noting here, Madam President, that while Mr. Annan was holding intensive talks with his Syrian interlocutors, some were holding conferences that are parallel to Annan's plan in Istanbul in a clear attempt to circumvent his mission and the role of the United Nations, as well as an attempt to undermine the chances of the success of this mission and this role, and their attempt to help Syria exit this crisis. Some have even endorsed a funding mechanism that would enable Gulf countries to fund armed groups by offering salaries to members of these groups, not to mention the pledges taken by those attending the conference to offer $100 million in order to feed the flames of the crisis instead of extinguishing them. We add to this the calls that we have heard during this conference in particular, issued by the Qatari Foreign Minister calling for military intervention in Syria and establishing so-called safe zones on Syrian territory. We also note here the statement by the Saudi Foreign Minister, who said that arming the Syrian opposition is necessary. And we pose a question here. What does it mean when some states say that they support Annan's mission while undertaking parallel activities that aim to guarantee necessary funding for armed groups and to arm them and militarize them, as well as impose sanctions on the Syrian people while calling for direct military intervention in my country? All of these are issues that are in complete contradiction with the text of Kofi Annan's plan. Therefore, we would like to affirm to this esteemed Council that the continued support of these armed groups will pose a true threat to Kofi Annan's plan. And the parties who play this role are responsible for shedding the blood of Syrians and spreading terrorism in Syria. The states that have imposed unjust economic sanctions on the Syrian people are also partners in this crisis, and these states cannot shed crocodile tears over the difficulties that Syrian citizens are facing in their daily lives, while they themselves are responsible for these difficulties to a large extent. What else would be the purpose of the external manipulation of the Syrian pound's exchange rate? What is the purpose of preventing Syrian expatriates from wiring their money back to their families in Syria? What else would be the purpose of harming the Syrian energy sector? Is the purpose from all this to guarantee the well-being of Syrian people and to fulfill their demands for reform? And what about the European Union's imposition of sanctions on the Syrian Minister of Power of Electricity? Will that help deliver electric power to the Syrian people? All of these culminate in an unethical crisis that we must examine. Madam President, what is happening in Syria is a manifestation of a geopolitical conflict over regional roles. It is a settling of scores. Some of these are old scores and some are newer scores. And the main weapon in this war and this conflict seems to be through pitting political pan-Arabism against extremist political Islam, in that extremist manifestations are being spread in order to feed future wars in the region that will come in the form of sectarian, religious, and ethnic crises that aim to fragment the region. All this aims to put an end to the last location of coexistence and fraternity and diversity in the region, and to entrench the concept of clash and confrontation between religions, cultures, and civilizations in it. In closing, Syria repeats its commitment to the plan of the Special Envoy's plan, and it is ready to continue cooperating with him in order to put an end to the crisis in Syria. We hope that Mr. Kofi Annan would not allow anyone or any other party to bypass his plan and to circumvent its content. The resolution adopted by the Council today requires the dedication of the countries that have proposed it and adopted it and which have persisted in their support of armed groups in Syria. And while we feel that this resolution was not balanced, yet Syria affirms that it is in its interest to guarantee the return of security and stability to the country. We hope that the countries who abide by this resolution would implement it practically and would not send lethal or non-lethal aid to the terrorists and the armed groups. I would also like to affirm before